The letter arrived on a day when the dust was so thick that Thornton Xavier could barely see the silhouette of his own barn from the porch of his weathered ranch house. Colorado Territory, 1872, was unforgiving to a man who worked alone, and the 30-acre spread Thornton had inherited from his late father was slowly consuming what remained of his youth and optimism. "She's comin' next Tuesday," he mumbled to himself, folding the telegram and tucking it into his shirt pocket. The bride service in Denver had confirmed that Miss Winifred Farley would arrive on the afternoon stage from St. Louis. Thornton ran his calloused hands through his sun-bleached hair, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. At 32, Thornton had resigned himself to the likelihood of a solitary existence. The nearest town of Silver Pine was 15 miles away, and the few unmarried women there had long since made it clear they had no interest in a man whose ranch was barely surviving. But loneliness had finally driven him to place an advertisement in Eastern newspapers, offering marriage and a life in the West to any woman brave enough to accept. Miss Farley had been the only one to respond. Thornton glanced around his modest home. The past week had been spent in a flurry of cleaning and repairs he'd neglected for years. The cabin wasn't much: 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a small sitting area, but he'd scrubbed every inch until it gleamed. He'd even ordered new curtains from the general store, paying extra for rush delivery. "She'll either take one look and head straight back east, or she'll be too desperate to care," he muttered to his dog, Rusty, who thumped his tail sympathetically against the wooden floor. Tuesday arrived with unexpected mercy. The skies were clear, the temperature mild for April, and Thornton had managed to shave without cutting himself, a feat he considered a good omen. He hitched his best horse to the wagon and set out for town 3 hours before the stage was due, determined not to be late. Silver Pine was bustling with its usual afternoon activity when Thornton arrived. He nodded politely to the townspeople, ignoring the curious glances. Everyone knew why he was there. News traveled fast in small towns, and the arrival of a mail-order bride was the most exciting thing to happen since the Hanson twins had accidentally set fire to the livery stable last Christmas. "Today's the day, Xavier?" called Harlan Potter from the doorway of his general store. "Reckon so," Thornton replied, trying to appear nonchalant as he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the stage depot. "Hope she's sturdy," Potter continued. "You need a woman who can handle ranch life." Thornton didn't respond. He'd heard similar comments all week about how he needed someone hardy, robust, or built for breeding. The frontier was cruel to delicate things. Everyone reminded him, as if he hadn't lived there his entire life. The stage arrived promptly at 3 o'clock, the driver expertly guiding the team of 6 horses to a stop in front of the depot. Thornton stood awkwardly to one side, hat in hand, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain everyone could hear it. The driver jumped down and opened the door. A distinguished older couple emerged first, followed by a traveling salesman, and finally, a slender woman in a dove-gray traveling suit stepped carefully onto the wooden platform. She was small, that was Thornton's first thought. Delicate, like a bird, with pale blonde hair pinned neatly beneath a modest hat. Her face was heart-shaped, her complexion fair despite obvious fatigue from the journey. But what struck him most were her eyes, large, expressive, and the clearest shade of blue he'd ever seen, like the Colorado sky in autumn. "Miss Farley?" he asked, stepping forward hesitantly. "Mr. Xavier." Her voice was soft but clear, with a slight Eastern accent that rounded her vowels pleasantly. He nodded, suddenly at a loss for words. She was nothing like he'd imagined, not plain or desperate or hardened by life. She was lovely, refined, and completely out of place in the dusty frontier town. "I'm pleased to meet you," she said, extending a gloved hand that seemed almost childlike in its smallness. "The pleasure's mine, madam," he replied, taking her hand carefully. "Do you have luggage?" "Just one trunk," she said. Gesturing to where the driver was already unloading a modest wooden trunk, Thornton paid the driver and arranged for the trunk to be loaded onto his wagon. All the while, he was acutely aware of the stares from townspeople who had found excuses to linger near the depot. He could almost hear their thoughts she wouldn't last a month. She was too fragile, too refined, too thin. When they were finally settled in the wagon, Thornton hesitated before flicking the reins. "It's a fair distance to the ranch," he said. "About 15 miles. We'll be there before sundown." Winifred nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I understand. I've prepared myself for frontier life, Mr. Xavier." Something in her tone made him glance at her sharply. There was determination beneath the gentleness, a steel he hadn't initially perceived. The journey passed mostly in silence. Occasionally, Thornton would point out a landmark or name a distant mountain range. Winifred asked polite questions about the ranch and the surrounding countryside, but neither mentioned the arrangement that had brought them together or the future they were supposedly going to share. As they approached the ranch, Thornton found himself seeing it through her eyes: the weathered fence posts, the modest cabin, the small barn and corral. It wasn't much, certainly nothing like whatever life she'd left behind in the East. "This is it," he said unnecessarily as he drew the wagon to a stop. "It's not much, but it's home." "It's lovely," she said, though her voice betrayed uncertainty. Thornton helped her down from the wagon, uncomfortably aware of how easily he lifted her, how fragile she felt. He carried her trunk inside while she stood in the yard, taking in her surroundings. "I'll show you around," he said, returning to her side. "The house isn't large, but there's a bedroom for you. I'll be taking the small room off the kitchen until we decide on arrangements." A blush crept into her cheeks, but she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Xavier, that's very considerate." The tour was brief: the house first, then the barn and chicken coop, the vegetable garden he'd expanded in anticipation of her arrival, and finally the small creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property. "The water's good," he explained. "Never runs dry, even in August." "It's all very practical," she observed. "You've built a good life here." "A hard one," he corrected. "Ranch life isn't easy, Miss Farley, especially out here." "I didn't expect it to be," she replied, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. "I wouldn't have come if I was afraid of hard work." Thornton studied her, trying to reconcile the delicate woman before him with her confident words. "May I ask why you did come? What made you answer an advertisement from a stranger in a territory you've never seen?" She looked away, watching the sun beginning its descent behind the mountains. "My father died last year. He was a professor at a ladies' college in Massachusetts. He left debts I couldn't pay and the house had to be sold. I took a position as a governess, but—" She hesitated. "Let's just say the master of the house had expectations beyond teaching his children." Thornton's jaw tightened. "I see. I had few options. When I saw your advertisement, it seemed providential, a chance to begin again somewhere completely different. And now that you're here." "Does it still seem providential?" A small smile touched her lips. "Ask me again in a week, Mr. Xavier." They settled into an uneasy routine. Winifred proved surprisingly adept at cooking, transforming the simple provisions Thornton kept into meals that reminded him of his mother's cooking. She took over the chicken coop immediately, increasing egg production within days by implementing a feeding schedule she'd read about in a farming journal. But physical labor was another matter. She tried, Lord knows, she tried, but her slim arms couldn't manage the water pump for more than a few minutes before exhaustion set in. Laundry left her hands raw and chapped. The vegetable garden defeated her completely. She knew which plants were which but lacked the strength to properly work the soil. Thornton found himself doing more to compensate, rising earlier and working later. He never complained, but Winifred noticed. "I'm not what you expected," she said on the evening of their 5th day together. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "No," he admitted, "but that's not necessarily bad." "The entire town thinks I'm unsuitable," she continued, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. "I heard Mrs. Potter tell the milliner that I wouldn't survive my first winter, that I'm too thin to bear children, too weak to be a rancher's wife." Thornton sighed. "Silverpine has a shortage of entertainment. Gossiping about newcomers is how some folks pass the time. But they're not wrong, are they? Look at me, Mr. Xavier, I'm not built for this life." He turned to face her fully. "Do you want to leave? I won't hold you to our arrangement if you're unhappy." Tears glistened in her eyes. "Where would I go? What would I do? I used every penny I had to come here." "I'd pay your way back east," he said quietly. "It wouldn't be right to keep you somewhere you don't belong." She was silent for a long moment. "Do you want me to leave?" The question caught him off guard. Did he? The practical part of him knew she wasn't the ideal frontier wife. She would struggle with the physical demands of ranch life. Her health might suffer. She might grow to resent him and the isolation of their existence. But when he really looked at her, he saw something he hadn't expected to find. A kindred spirit. Someone who understood loneliness and sacrifice, who faced challenges with quiet determination rather than complaint. Someone whose presence had already made his house feel more like a home than it had in years. "No," he said finally. "I don't want you to leave." A week later, Thornton received a visit from Elijah Simmons, the owner of the largest ranch in the county and president of the Cattlemen's Association. Simmons was a widower in his 50s with 3 grown sons and a reputation for straight talk. "Heard you got yourself a mail-order bride," Simmons said without preamble, accepting the coffee Winifred offered before she discreetly excused herself to give the men privacy. "News travels fast," Thornton replied dryly. "Small town," Simmons shrugged. "Folks are concerned." "About what? About her?" Simmons nodded toward the door Winifred had exited through. "She's not cut out for this life, Xavier. Anyone can see that. Pretty little thing, but no substance to her. First hard winter or difficult birth would likely kill her." Thornton's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "I appreciate your concern, but my arrangement with Miss Farley is our business. It becomes the community's business when we'll eventually have to step in and help. You think you're doing her a kindness by keeping her here, but you're not. Send her back east while she still has a chance at a suitable life." "And what would you consider suitable?" "Someone stronger, someone who knows what ranch life entails." Simmons set down his cup. "My niece is arriving from Kansas next month. 24, healthy as a horse and raised on a cattle ranch. She's looking to marry, and I told her about you." Thornton stared at him in disbelief. "You're suggesting I send Winifred away and marry your niece instead?" "I'm suggesting you be practical. Margaret is exactly the kind of woman you need. She can pull her weight and then some." After Simmons left, Thornton found Winifred in the garden, attempting to weed the rows of young vegetables. Her hat protected her fair skin from the sun, but her dress was smudged with dirt, and her hands were trembling slightly from exertion. "You heard?" he asked, knowing the small house made privacy nearly impossible. She nodded without looking up. Mr. Simmons wasn't trying to be quiet. Thornton knelt beside her, gently taking the trowel from her hands. "Your hands are bleeding." "I'll get calluses eventually," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "Everyone does. Winifred, is he right? Would his niece be better for you, for this place?" Thornton sat back on his heels, considering how to answer. "Probably," he said finally with brutal honesty, "from a practical standpoint." She flinched as if he'd struck her, but he continued. "She'd likely be stronger, more familiar with ranch work. She might make things easier in some ways." "I see," Winifred whispered, rising to her feet. "I'll start packing my things." "I'm not finished," Thornton said, standing as well. "She might be more practical, but I don't want practical. I don't want someone who reminds me of every other rancher's wife for 50 miles. I don't want someone who fits everyone else's idea of what I need." He took a step closer to her. "The truth is, since you arrived, I've started seeing this place differently. You've brought something here that I didn't even know was missing. When you talk about the books you've read or the places you hope to see someday, it reminds me that there's a world beyond these acres. When you leave wildflowers on the table or sing while you're cooking, it makes this place feel like more than just land I'm working until I die." Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. "I don't care what Simmons or anyone else thinks," Thornton continued. "You're the only one I see when I think about a future here. If you want to stay, I want you to stay, even though I can't pull my weight." She asked, her voice small. "You pull your weight in ways they don't understand," he said firmly, "and the rest we'll figure out together." That evening, Thornton rode into town alone. He returned late, long after Winifred had gone to bed, but was up before dawn as usual. When she entered the kitchen, she found him constructing something at the table. "What are you making?" she asked, tying an apron around her waist. "Come see," he invited. It was a series of wooden platforms and steps leading up to the water pump, positioned so that when she stood on them, the pump handle was at the perfect height for her to use leverage rather than strength to operate it. "I thought this might help," he said. "I can make similar adjustments for other tasks that have been difficult." Tears filled her eyes. "You did this for me. It's just the start," he promised. "I also spoke with Doc Miller in town last night. He says you're not too thin, you're just fine the way you are. He thinks the Potters and Simmons and all the rest are used to women who have had to build muscle from years of frontier life. You haven't had that opportunity yet, but it doesn't mean you can't adapt." "Thank you," she whispered. "There's more," Thornton continued, suddenly nervous. "I ordered some books from Denver, farming journals specifically written for women, and I've hired a boy from town to come help with the heaviest work 3 days a week. Young Billy Carson needs the money for his family, and it will give you time to adjust without exhausting yourself." Winifred stared at him, a slow smile spreading across her face. "You really want this to work?" "I do," he confirmed. "More than I've wanted anything in a long time." That afternoon, they received another visitor. Mrs. Potter, the general store owner's wife, arrived in her buggy bearing what she called a welcome basket, though Winifred had already been at the ranch for nearly 2 weeks. "I just wanted to see how you were settling in," Mrs. Potter said, her eyes critically assessing Winifred's slight figure. "Ranch life can be such an adjustment for Eastern ladies." "It certainly has its challenges," Winifred agreed pleasantly, serving tea in the mismatched cups she'd recently organized. "But Mr. Xavier has been very patient." Mrs. Potter sipped her tea, eyes roaming the modest cabin. "I understand Elijah Simmons paid you a visit yesterday. His niece Margaret is a wonderful girl, sturdy, practical, excellent cook from what I hear." "Is she?" Winifred replied, her voice carefully neutral. "How nice for her." "I've always thought Thornton needed a strong woman, Mrs. Potter continued, oblivious to the tension. "Someone who could really contribute to building this ranch. No offense intended, my dear, but you seem rather delicate for frontier life." Thornton, who had been silently watching the exchange from the doorway, stepped into the room. "Mrs. Potter, while we appreciate your visit, I should clarify something. Miss Farley contributes more to this ranch than anyone could see at first glance. She's educated, resourceful, and determined. She's exactly who I want here." Mrs. Potter's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Well, I was only thinking of your future, Thornton. Everyone knows a ranch needs a certain type of woman to thrive." "My ranch needs Winifred," he said firmly. "No one else." After Mrs. Potter left, clearly offended, Winifred turned to Thornton with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "You shouldn't have antagonized her. The Potters are important in town." "So are we," he replied simply. "They'll either accept that or they won't, but I'm done listening to their opinions about our life. Our life." The words hung between them, significant and unexplored. "We haven't discussed the actual marriage," Winifred said quietly. "The agreement was that we would marry after I arrived, but you haven't mentioned it." Thornton ran a hand through his hair. "I wanted to give you time, to see if you could be happy here before making it official. And if I can't? If I'm never as strong as Margaret Simmons or as practical as Mrs. Potter thinks I should be," he crossed the room until he stood directly in front of her, "then we'll find ways to adapt this place to you instead of forcing you to adapt to it. I don't want a workhorse, Winifred. I want a partner." "Is that what I am, your partner? You could be," he said softly. "You could be much more if you wanted." The air between them seemed to still filled with possibility. "I think I would like that," she whispered. The following Sunday, they attended church in Silverpine for the first time together. Winifred wore her best dress, a pale blue that matched her eyes, and Thornton wore the only suit he owned, somewhat outdated but freshly pressed. They were the subject of many curious stares and whispered comments. Thornton felt Winifred tense beside him as they passed the pew where Elijah Simmons sat with his family. "Ignore them," Thornton murmured, placing his hand protectively at the small of her back. After the service, as congregation members gathered on the church steps, Simmons approached them directly. "Xavier," he nodded curtly. "Miss Farley, I see you've decided to stay." "I have," Winifred replied with quiet dignity. "Despite our conversation," Simmons continued, addressing Thornton. "Because of it, actually," Thornton corrected. "You helped me realize exactly what I wanted, and it isn't what you or anyone else thinks I should have," Simmons frowned. "You're making a mistake. The girl's not built for this territory." "Perhaps the territory needs to make room for different kinds of strength," came a new voice. Doc Miller had joined their circle, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled at Winifred. "Miss Farley shows every sign of good health, Mr. Simmons. Her build is different from what we're used to seeing in frontier women, but that doesn't make her unfit." "I appreciate your medical opinion, Doctor," Simmons said stiffly, "but experience tells me experience can sometimes narrow our vision," interrupted Mrs. Miller, the doctor's wife and a respected figure in the community. "When I first came west 30 years ago, everyone said I was too educated to be happy as a frontier wife, that my books and ideas would make me discontent. They were wrong." She turned to Winifred with a warm smile. "Different strengths build different kinds of lives, my dear. Don't let anyone tell you which kind you're allowed to have." The Millers' support marked a turning point. While not everyone in Silverpine was immediately won over, their endorsement gave Winifred a measure of acceptance she hadn't previously experienced. As spring turned to summer, the ranch began to transform. Winifred might not have had the physical strength of a traditional frontier wife, but she had organizational skills that revolutionized how the small ranch operated. She implemented crop rotation techniques she'd read about, started a careful breeding program for the chickens, and kept meticulous records of expenses and income that helped them make more strategic decisions. Thornton continued to modify tools and processes to accommodate her physical limitations. He built a special cart that made it easier for her to transport water and laundry. He designed a harness system in the garden that allowed her to weed without constantly bending and kneeling. Together, they found workarounds for almost every challenge. Their relationship evolved as gradually as the season. The awkwardness of their early days gave way to comfortable companionship and eventually to something deeper. Thornton found himself looking forward to evenings on the porch, listening to Winifred read aloud from one of her books. She discovered an unexpected joy in watching him work with the horses, his quiet confidence and gentle handling revealing a tenderness that matched her own. They were married in late August, a small ceremony in the Silverpine Church, followed by a modest celebration at the ranch. To Winifred's surprise, most of the town attended, including the Potters and even Elijah Simmons, who gruffly presented them with a fine heifer as a wedding gift. "Still think you could have done better," he muttered to Thornton, "but I admire a man who stands by his choices." "I didn't just stand by my choice," Thornton replied. "I made the right one." Their wedding night was tender and uncertain, both of them navigating unfamiliar territory with equal measures of desire and nervousness. But as with everything else they'd faced, they found their way together, discovering a physical connection that complemented the emotional bond they'd been building for months. Autumn brought the harvest, and their first real test as a married couple. The work was relentless, the days long, and despite all their adaptations, There were times when Winifred's body simply couldn't keep up with the demands. "I'm sorry," she said one evening, barely able to lift her arms to remove her apron after a day of preserving vegetables for winter. "I'm slowing you down." Thornton gently took the apron from her hands. "You're not slowing me down. You're making sure we don't waste a single thing we've grown. Before you came, half of what I grew rotted because I didn't have time to preserve it properly. But if you had someone stronger, if I had someone else, I might have more help with physical labor," he acknowledged. "But I wouldn't have your mind, your planning, your vision for what this place could become." He cupped her face in his calloused hands. "I wouldn't have you, Winnie. And that would be the greatest loss of all." It was the first time he'd used the diminutive of her name, and something about it, the casual intimacy, the quiet affection, broke through the last of her reserves. "I love you," she said, the words emerging with the certainty of a truth long known but newly spoken. "I love you, Thornton Xavier, and I don't care if I never become what they think a frontier wife should be." His smile was slow and sweet, transforming his weathered face. "I love you too. And you're exactly the frontier wife I need." Winter arrived with biting winds and heavy snows that isolated the ranch for days at a time. Winifred had prepared diligently, filling the root cellar with preserved foods, stocking the pantry with supplies from town, and insisting they lay in twice the firewood Thornton thought necessary. "You were right about the wood," he admitted in January, after a blizzard that lasted 3 days. "We'd be freezing if we'd only cut what I planned." "Foresight," she said with a smile, "my contribution to our survival." They settled into a winter routine, early mornings caring for the animals, days spent on indoor projects and repairs, evenings by the fire where Thornton was slowly working his way through the books Winifred had brought from the East. She was teaching him about literature and history. He was teaching her about carpentry and animal husbandry. Both were eager students. In February, Winifred confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks. She was expecting a child, due in late summer. Thornton's reaction was a mixture of joy and concern. "Are you sure you're strong enough?" he asked, his hand gently covering hers. "What Doc Miller said about your health was that I'm perfectly healthy, just built differently," she reminded him. "Women of all sizes have babies, Thornton. My mother was small like me, and she had 3 children without difficulty." Still, as her pregnancy progressed, the whispers in town resumed. Winifred pretended not to notice the sidelong glances or hear the muttered predictions about her ability to safely deliver a child. But Thornton noticed, and his protective instincts intensified. "We should consider having the baby in Denver," he suggested in early summer. "They have a proper hospital there." Winifred shook her head. "Doc Miller delivered half the children in this county without incident. I trust him. And I want our child born here, on the land that will be their inheritance." As her due date approached, Thornton sent for Doc Miller's wife to stay with them, unwilling to risk being alone when Winifred's time came. Mrs. Miller arrived with her medical bag and years of experience assisting her husband at births throughout the territory. "You're doing beautifully," she assured Winifred during an examination. "The baby is positioned perfectly, and you're as healthy as any expectant mother I've seen." When labor began on a warm August evening, Thornton found himself banished to the porch, where he paced relentlessly, flinching at every sound from within the house. Doc Miller arrived an hour later, nodding reassuringly as he passed. "Don't worry, Xavier," he said. "Your wife is stronger than she looks." The labor lasted through the night and into the following morning. Just as Thornton was considering breaking down the door, a new sound pierced the air, the indignant wail of a newborn taking its first breath. When he was finally allowed inside, Thornton found Winifred propped up in bed, tired but radiant, cradling a small bundle. "You have a daughter," she said softly as he approached. "She's small like me, but Doc Miller says she's perfect." Thornton sat carefully on the edge of the bed, staring in wonder at the tiny face peering out from the blankets. The baby had a dusting of dark hair like his and eyes that, even in these first hours, hinted at her mother's clear blue. "She's beautiful," he whispered, gently touching her miniature hand, "just like her mother." Doc Miller cleared his throat from the doorway. "I'll be heading back to town now. Everything went smoothly, textbook delivery. I'll check in on you both in a few days." After the doctor left, Thornton stretched out beside Winifred on the bed, one arm around her shoulders, the other helping to support their daughter. "I was afraid," he admitted. "When everyone kept saying you weren't strong enough, I started to believe them." "I know," she said, leaning against him. "But different kinds of strength, remember?" He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I remember, and I've never seen anyone stronger than you were today." They named their daughter Elizabeth Hope Xavier Elizabeth after Winifred's mother, and hope for what she represented to both of them. The promise of a future neither had believed possible before finding each other. Word spread quickly through Silverpine about the safe arrival of the Xavier baby. To the couple's surprise, visitors began arriving the very next day. Mrs. Potter with a handmade quilt, Elijah Simmons with a silver rattle that had belonged to his own children, and others bearing gifts and congratulations. "She's a fine-looking child," Simmons declared, studying Elizabeth with unexpected softness. "Got your eyes, Miss Winifred. Lucky girl." "Thank you," Winifred replied, noting the use of her first name, a first from the gruff rancher. Mrs. Potter lingered after the others had gone. "I owe you an apology," she said, uncharacteristically humble. "I judged you unfairly when you arrived. I thought I knew what Thornton needed better than he did." "It's forgotten," Winifred assured her. "Not by me," Mrs. Potter insisted. "You've proven yourself in ways none of us expected. You've made this ranch thrive, and you've given Thornton something I never thought he'd have: happiness." She smiled at the baby. "And now a family too." As autumn returned to the Colorado Territory, the Xavier Ranch stood transformed from the struggling homestead of a year before. The house had expanded by 2 rooms, built during the summer with help from neighbors who had finally accepted that the unlikely couple were a permanent fixture in their community. The garden had doubled in size, the chicken flock tripled, and plans were underway for expanding the cattle herd in the spring. One evening, as the first hints of frost silvered the grass, Thornton and Winifred sat on their porch watching the sunset, baby Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. "I've been thinking," Thornton said, his arm draped comfortably around his wife's shoulders. "Remember when you first arrived and I asked if coming here still seemed providential? And I told you to ask me again in a week," she recalled with a smile. "It's been considerably longer than a week." "So it has." "So," he prompted, "does it still seem providential, coming here, I mean? Taking a chance on a stranger, and a life you knew nothing about." Winifred gazed out at the land that had become her home, at the life they had built against all expectations. She thought of the struggles they'd overcome, the adaptations they'd made, the love they'd found in the most unlikely of circumstances. "Providential doesn't begin to describe it," she said softly. "It feels like destiny." Thornton tightened his arm around her. "Even though everyone said you were too thin, too delicate, too refined for this life, especially because of that," she replied. "Their doubts made us work harder to find our own way, to build something that works for us, not for anyone else's expectations." They sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky, the first stars appearing overhead. In the distance, a coyote called, its voice echoing across the valley that was now home to 3 Xaviers instead of 1. "I'm glad I was stubborn," Thornton said finally. "When they told me to send you back," Winifred leaned her head against his shoulder. "I'm glad you saw something in me that they couldn't." "I saw everything," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her hair. "You're the only one I see, you always will be."